Hey, tonight let's take a slow, honest walk through the world of the medieval peasant. Not the fancy halls or feast tables, but the muddy tracks, the cramped homes, and the constant fight to make it to the next meal. I want to show you how tough, how relentless, and how downright unfair peasant life could be. But also how these folks managed to keep going, day after day, even when the odds were stacked against them. It wasn't about fancy food or feasts. It was about scraping by, one mouthful at a time, in a world that often seemed like it was built to keep you down. And as we go, you'll see what I mean. Take a moment to subscribe, but only if you truly love what I do here. Comment what's your hardest time of day and how you keep going. Now, if you're laying flat, dim those lights, get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's dive into the hard peasant life. It all starts with the earth. The same earth they worked until their hands cracked and their backs ached. Imagine a small village in what's now northern Germany, around 1325. It's spring, but the fields are still cold and wet. The plows are heavy, dragged by oxen if you're lucky, by you and your family if you're not. Every row you turn is a gamble. Will the seed take? Will the weather cooperate? Will the taxes this year leave you with enough to eat? There's no break from that worry. Home isn't much of a refuge either. It's a small, smoky room shared by everyone. Parents, kids, maybe a grandparent or two. The air's always thick with the smell of peat smoke and boiled greens. The walls are patched with mud and straw, and you can feel the cold seeping in through every crack when winter comes. If you're hungry, and let's be honest, most peasants were always at least a little hungry, you eat whatever's there. A pot of pottage bubbling over the fire, made from barley or oats, and maybe a few tired carrots or onions. If you're lucky, there's a scrap of salt pork or a bone to add flavor. But more often than not, it's thin, watery, and barely enough to fill your belly. The bread's coarse, made from flour that's got more husk than grain some years. When times are really bad, you might be eating bread bulked out with ground beans or even crushed acorns. It doesn't taste good, but it keeps you going. And that's all you're really asking for, to keep going. Every season has its own fight. Spring means endless back-breaking work in the fields. Summer brings hope and worry. Will the grain ripen? Will the animals stay healthy? Autumn is a mad dash to get it all stored before the cold sets in. And winter's when you really find out if you've done enough. Because once the snow falls and the ground freezes, what you've got in the cellar or hanging from the rafters is all there is. No fresh milk from the cow, no eggs from the chickens. Just what you managed to save, and maybe what you can beg or trade for. Hunger isn't just a passing feeling in this world. It's a shadow that's always there. It's knowing that if your pig dies of disease, there's no meat this year. It's hoping that the bread lasts until Lent is over. It's watching your children's faces as they eat thin soup night after night. And then there's the Lord's share, taxes and dues that have to be paid no matter how bad the harvest was. You might hand over the best of your grain, your eggs, your wool, and still be left wondering how you'll make it to next season. The church bells ring out the rhythm of the day, but they also ring out reminders of your place. Pray, fast, be patient, they say. It's hard to be patient when your belly's empty and the cold bites your bones. But you have no choice. And even in all this, there are small joys. A warm hearth when the wind howls. A loaf of bread pulled from the oven, hot and crackling. A neighbor's helping hand when your back gives out or your thatch roof leaks. Because as tough as peasant life was, nobody got through it alone. You leaned on family, on neighbors, on the small moments that made it all feel bearable, even if just for a little while. So tonight, as you close your eyes and let the firelight of that smoky hearth fill your mind, remember this: peasants didn't just survive because they were tough. They survived because they knew how to share, because they understood that even in the hardest times, a warm bowl of broth and a kind word could mean everything. We've just begun to scratch the surface. We keep moving now, through the daily grind of peasant life. Because for them, there was never really a break. There was no morning coffee to ease into the day, just cold air and the weight of another dawn, another day of work that never seemed to end. You'd wake to the sound of roosters, but there was no sense of leisure, only the rush to get the fire going, to get something warm in your belly before the real labor started. A crust of bread, stale and rough, dipped in a bit of ale to soften it. Not for pleasure, but because the ale was safer than water, and it would give you a bit of warmth to face the chill outside. Then it was out into the fields, no matter the weather. If you were lucky, the land was yours to work, even if it still belonged to someone else. If you weren't, you were working another man's land for a handful of coins or a promise of grain come harvest. Spring was for plowing, turning heavy, wet earth with wooden tools that pulled at your shoulders, tore at your hands. Summer was for weeding, the sun burning your skin as you bent low over rows of barley and rye. Autumn was for the harvest, a frantic rush before the frost. And winter was never rest. It was cutting wood, mending roofs, patching clothing so thin it barely held out the cold. There was no room to be lazy, no time to be sick. Even children worked, carrying water, watching animals, picking weeds from the garden patch that was as important as any field. Every day was a test of how much your body could take, how much you could wring from the land and still have something left for tomorrow. When you finally came back inside, the house wasn't much of a relief. The air thick with smoke from the hearth, the walls thin enough that the wind slipped in at every seam. You'd sit close to the fire, your skin red from the heat, your back aching from the cold you couldn't quite push away. Dinner was what you had. No choices, no fuss. A pot of pottage bubbling slow, with barley and onions, maybe a carrot or two if luck had been on your side. A scrap of pork fat or an old bone if there was anything to spare. Most nights it was thin. Most nights it was never enough to truly fill you. But it was something. And you learned to be grateful for something. The landlord's share was always there too. The best of what you grew never stayed in your own kitchen. It went up to the manor, to the lord who claimed the land, the taxes, the first cut of everything. Even in the worst years, the grain was counted, the tithes demanded. You paid because you had no choice. Because saying no wasn't an option. It meant losing your small plot of earth, the only thing that kept you from hunger's teeth. And still, even with so little, there were small kindnesses. A neighbor sharing a handful of beans to thicken your stew. A child running in with wild garlic pulled from the woods. A bit of honeycomb, sweet and sticky, passed around the fire. These weren't grand feasts. They were survival, shared. When the nights grew longest and the stores ran low, the songs and stories came out. Not because they were happy, but because they reminded you that you weren't alone. That there was something beyond the hunger, something worth holding on to. The truth was simple and harsh. Peasant life was a life of endless work and endless worry. But it was also a life where even a crust of bread, even a warm bowl of soup, was a victory. And tonight, as you drift off, think of those small victories, the breath of warm air from a crowded hearth, the hush of a shared meal, the stubborn hope that carried them through. We're not done yet. Let's keep going, because winter was the true test of a peasant's life. The fields slept under snow, but there was no sleep for those who lived off them. The nights grew longer, and the cold seeped through every crack in the walls, every gap in the thatched roof. You'd wrap yourself in whatever scraps of cloth you had, wool if you were lucky, rags if you weren't, and still the cold bit at your bones. The fire in the hearth was never enough. It smoked and hissed, warm only for those who could press close. For everyone else, the cold was a constant ache, a reminder that you didn't have enough. And that was winter's true cruelty. It took what little you had and stretched it thinner, every day another challenge to make it last. The food stores had to carry you through until the first green shoots of spring. The root cellar held what was left: onions, turnips, maybe a few carrots, all soft and sprouting by January. The smoked meat, if there was any, was rationed carefully. A scrap here to flavor a pot of broth, a slice there on feast days or Sundays. For most meals, it was the same pottage, night after night. Barley and water, thickened with whatever you could find. Maybe a few dried beans, maybe a handful of last summer's herbs. It was filling if you had enough, but never enough to truly fill. And always, the landlord's share was still due. Even if your children were crying with hunger, the manor would have its tithe. The grain you'd hoped would last the winter, the eggs you'd been saving, the best of what you had. To refuse was unthinkable. It was survival, but it was never freedom. Some winters, when the weather turned cruel, famine crept in like a thief. A single bad harvest could mean empty bellies and desperate choices. Families would gather wild greens from the forest edge, sorrel, nettles, bitter herbs that burned the tongue but filled the stomach. Bread would be mixed with ground peas, beans, even the bark of trees. It was rough, it was hard, but it was food. And when even that ran out, there were only prayers left. The church bells still rang, marking the hours, the seasons, the endless repetition of work and want. The priests said patience would be rewarded in the next life. The peasants listened, but in the cold it was hard to believe. Still, they kept going, because there was no other choice, because the fire had to be fed, the animals had to be tended, the children had to be kept warm. Because even in the hardest times, there was still a glimmer of stubborn hope. A neighbor's pot shared on a freezing night, a child's laughter that cut through the hunger, a loaf of bread hot from the oven that made the dark feel a little less heavy. So tonight, as you lie quiet and warm, think of those winter nights in low, smoky cottages, the hush of snow outside, the smell of peat smoke and boiling barley, the small joys, a full belly, a warm corner, a moment of peace. These were the victories that kept them going, even in the coldest months. Spring was a promise, but it wasn't a quick one. The snow melted, leaving the ground wet and heavy, but green was slow to come. You'd watch the sky every morning, willing the sun to break through the gray, willing the first shoots to push through the cold earth. For a peasant, spring meant work, back-breaking, endless work. The plow came out again, pulled by oxen if you had them, or by you and your neighbors if you didn't. The soil was thick and stubborn, clinging to the blade. But you had to cut it open, make it ready to give life again. The children helped, scattering seeds by hand, small fingers numb from the chill. Barley, rye, beans, anything that might grow. You didn't have the luxury of choice. The kitchen garden, that small patch of hope behind the house, was cleared and turned too. You planted leeks, onions, maybe a row of herbs if you had a few seeds saved. Every bite that didn't have to be bought or begged was another day of breathing a little easier. Even so, spring was thin. The stores from winter were nearly gone. The bread was hard and dark, cut thinner each day. The broth was mostly water, flavored with the last onion, maybe a handful of wilted greens from the forest edge. But even that was better than nothing, and there was something about those first green shoots that made every cold, damp morning feel just a little brighter. The animals, if you were lucky enough to have them, felt it too. The chickens laid more eggs, and that was a blessing you didn't take for granted. The cow, lean from winter, gave milk again, sweet and warm and thick with the promise of spring. These small returns were lifelines. They meant you'd made it through another winter, but there was no time to rest. Taxes still had to be paid. The landlord's steward would come, counting the seed you'd saved, the eggs your hens had laid. There was never enough left over. But you paid because you couldn't afford not to. And always, there was the threat of hunger if the season turned bad. A late frost could kill the first shoots. A sudden rain could wash the seed away. You lived by the weather's mood, and the weather didn't care. Still, even with the fear, spring brought a kind of quiet hope. You'd see it in the way neighbors worked together, helping to mend fences, to share seed if one family's stores had run dry. You'd feel it in the evenings when the fire was still small, but the air smelled of damp earth and the promise of new life. Even the children ran lighter, their bare feet muddy and their laughter loud. So tonight, think of that fragile hope. The green shoots pushing through cold earth, the first warm breeze after months of ice. Think of the peasant mother, stirring a pot of broth with a tired but hopeful heart. The way her eyes lifted to the window when the sun finally broke through. Because for the medieval peasant, spring was more than just another season. It was a chance to begin again. A chance to believe, even for a moment, that this year might be kinder than the last. There's more to tell, always. Summer didn't give you much of a break. The days were long, the sun high, and every hour brought more work. If spring was about hope, summer was about sweat. You rose with the dawn, not because you wanted to, but because there was no choice. The fields needed you. The barley and rye grew fast under the sun's heat, and you had to keep up. Weeds didn't care about your tired back. They sprouted overnight, green and choking, and you spent hours each day pulling them out by hand. Your fingers would turn raw from the work. Dirt caked under your nails no matter how often you tried to scrub it clean. But that was just how it was. There was no rest until the sun dipped low, and even then there were animals to tend. The cows needed milking, the chickens feeding. A goat, if you had one, would need to be kept from wandering into the garden. Every small job mattered. The kitchen garden grew fast too, if you were lucky. Rows of green leeks, cabbages fattening, herbs that gave the evening pot of broth a little more life. Those bright herbs were a kind of quiet blessing, their sharp, fresh smells cutting through the heaviness of the day. And the berries. Oh, the berries. Small wild strawberries in the hedgerows, blackberries later in the season, sweet enough to make you close your eyes and forget, just for a moment, how much your back hurt. Evenings were brief, but they were something to look forward to. You'd sit by the hearth, the air still warm from the day. Maybe there was bread, rough and dark, but hot from the communal oven. Maybe a bit of cheese if the cow had been generous. If there was extra, it was shared with a neighbor. You didn't hoard what you could spare, because you knew that in the hardest seasons, you'd need them too. The landlord's steward still came, counting out the sheaves you'd cut, measuring the weight of the grain. Taxes were a fact of life, a weight on your shoulders that never went away. You might grumble under your breath, but you paid. Because you had to. Because a peasant who didn't pay was a peasant who might not have a roof by winter. But even under the weight of all that labor and debt, there were small victories, a basket full of fresh peas, a mug of ale that cooled your throat after a hot day, a child's laughter as they ran barefoot through the dusty paths, their hair a mess and their cheeks flushed with life. Summer was hard, harder than any other season for sheer effort. But it was also the time when you could feel strongest. your arms firm from swinging the scythe, your shoulders straight from carrying bundles of grain. You earned every mouthful you ate, and that gave even the simplest meal a taste of pride. So tonight, as you let these words settle in your mind, think of that summer air, warm and heavy, smelling of cut grass and sweat, a rough hand wiping a brow, a soft laugh over a shared loaf. The kind of satisfaction that only comes when you know you've done what needed to be done. There's more ahead, of course. The harvest's rush, the lean years when even the sun can't save you, the small rebellions that flickered in the shadows. But for now, rest in this memory of summer, a season of sweat and green life, of sore shoulders and small joys that made it all feel worth it. Autumn was the final test. The fields turned gold and brown under a low sun, and the whole village moved like one body, all hands working together to bring the harvest in before the rains came. There was no waiting, no second chances. If you didn't move fast enough, the weather would take it all. The barley, the rye, the oats you'd planted with so much hope in spring. You'd wake before dawn, the air sharp and smelling of wet earth. Hands on scythes and sickles, you'd cut the grain down in slow, heavy swaths. Each stalk mattered. Each bundle was another chance to keep your family fed through the long months ahead. Children ran between the rows gathering what fell, carrying water for the men and women working the fields. No one was idle. Even the smallest child found a task. You'd eat in the fields, bread and cheese if you had it, sometimes just a crust in one hand while the other kept working. The days were long. Your shoulders ached. Your fingers blistered. But there was no time to complain. Winter was coming, and every sheaf of grain was another day you might not go hungry. Once the grain was in, there was threshing, the hard work of beating the grain free from the husks, the sound of flails on the barn floor, a steady rhythmic thud that echoed in your bones. Dust rose in the air, clung to your skin and clothes. You coughed, but you kept going, because you had to. Then came winnowing, lifting the grain in wide baskets, letting the wind take the chaff. A dance with the air, a hope that the breeze would blow just right. You'd watch the grain fall clean, each kernel precious as gold. After the grain came the garden's final gifts. Turnips, cabbages, onions pulled from the earth, carried inside with care. Apples and pears gathered in baskets, the last sweetness of the year. What you couldn't eat fresh you dried or stored. The cellar filled slowly, each jar and sack a promise against the cold. There was pride in that work, a kind of quiet triumph in seeing the stores fill up, in knowing you'd done what you could. But there was fear too, because you never knew if it would be enough. A storm could flood the cellars. A sickness could come and take what you'd saved. The landlord's steward came again in autumn, counting out what was his. You'd watch your grain disappear into carts bound for the manor, and you'd pray there was enough left to keep your own children fed. Still, there were small joys. An apple eaten fresh from the tree, its tart juice sharp and bright after months of dried bread. A night by the fire, your arms wrapped around your knees, the smell of onions and cabbage cooking low and slow. The crackle of wood, the hush of voices, the sense that, for tonight at least, you were safe. So as you rest tonight, think of those final, frantic weeks of harvest. The ache of tired muscles, the sweet bite of an autumn apple, the breath of relief when the last sheaf was stacked, the last root cellar closed tight against the coming frost. There's more ahead, the long dark of winter, the lean days when nothing grows, the quiet hopes that flicker in the cold. But tonight let that last bright day of harvest glow in your mind. You earned it. Winter came slowly but without mercy. The days shortened, the sun a weak flicker in the sky. The nights pressed in early, long and silent except for the wind and the crackle of the hearth. This was the season of counting, of weighing every loaf, measuring every handful of grain, hoping the cellar was deep enough, the stores full enough to see you through until spring. There was no room for waste. Every scrap of bread was eaten, every bit of broth sipped slow to stretch it out. You learned to make do, because there was no other choice. You wore the same clothes every day, patched and mended until the cloth felt thin as paper. The cold found every gap in the walls, every hole in the thatch. You'd huddle close to the fire, your breath a white cloud in the air. Even there, the warmth didn't reach your feet. The hearth was the center of the world in winter. It was where you cooked, where you ate, where you told stories to keep the dark at bay. The pot hung heavy over the coals, barley and roots simmering slow. Meat was rare and saved for feast days. A scrap of salt pork to flavor the broth. A thin slice of smoked sausage shared carefully. Most nights it was pottage again, thin and hot, and filling enough to quiet the worst of the hunger. If you had a cow, milk was a blessing, warm and rich, poured into wooden cups and sipped in the hush of the evening. If the cow went dry, you made do with ale or water, whatever was there. Nothing went to waste. Bones from the last slaughter were boiled twice, 3 times, until every bit of marrow was gone. Bread was toasted over the coals to soften it, dipped in the broth until it fell apart. The children learned early. Eat everything. Don't ask for more. There might not be more tomorrow. Some nights, the cold felt like a living thing. You'd wrap yourself in whatever rags you had, curl up close to your family, the baby pressed tight against her mother's chest. The older children nestled like puppies, sharing every bit of warmth. You'd hear the wind outside, howling through the trees, and wonder how much longer the stores would last. How many more days you could stretch the grain. And always there was the landlord's due. Even in the dead of winter, there were debts to pay. Eggs promised for spring. A share of the first milk. The knowledge that nothing you grew or raised was ever fully yours. Still, there were small comforts. A mug of ale on a cold night, its warmth a brief relief. The crackle of the fire when the room fell quiet. A song hummed low, soft as a prayer, to keep the children sleeping. These were the small gifts that kept you going, even when the world outside felt endless and cruel. So tonight, as you settle into the quiet, think of that winter darkness, the hush of snow outside, the slow simmer of a pot of barley, the strength it took to keep going day after cold day. There's more to tell of the ways peasants found hope in that dark season, of the small acts of kindness that flickered like candle flames against the cold. But for tonight, let that crackle of the hearth carry you off to sleep. You've earned it. In the depths of winter, every gesture of care was a thread that kept the fabric of life from tearing apart completely. Neighbors didn't have much, but they had each other. If a child fell sick, the woman next door might bring a jar of honey or a bundle of dried herbs, thyme, sage, anything to brew a healing tea. If the thatch leaked, you'd find 2 pairs of hands patching it before the next storm hit. It wasn't charity, it was survival. Because they all knew that if one family fell, the whole village would feel it. In those long nights, the old songs came out, not grand ballads but simple tunes, half lullaby, half prayer. Songs of saints and miracles, of harvests long past, of green fields waiting somewhere beyond the snow. Voices low and warm, weaving comfort in a world that could feel so cold. The church still rang its bells, marking the hours of darkness and light. Fasting days and feast days, each one a small reminder that even in the lean times, there was a rhythm bigger than hunger. On feast days, Christmas, Candlemas, the feasts of saints, the village came together. Bread was baked with what little honey or dried fruit could be spared. A goose or pig slaughtered if the year had been kind. Ale brewed strong and sweet, shared in battered cups that passed from hand to hand. For one night at least, the hunger was forgotten. The children's laughter rose with the crackle of the fire. The air smelled of roasted meat and warm bread. And for a little while, the world outside the door didn't matter. But the next morning always came. The cold was still there. The work was still there. Peasants knew how to take the joy where they could, to hold it close even as the lean days stretched on. They learned to find comfort in the smallest things. A warm bowl of broth, a quiet moment by the fire, your shoulders pressed against someone you loved. The hush of snow falling on thatch, soft as a blessing. Every winter was a test, not just of how much food you had, but of how much hope you could hold on to. And somehow, even in the worst of years, they kept that hope alive. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, think of those small, bright moments. A song shared in the dark, a pot of soup that lasted one more night, a neighbor's hand on your shoulder saying, "We're still here." There's more to see. The slow return of spring, the first green shoots breaking through the frost, the cycle of survival that started all over again. But for now, let the quiet of winter settle over you like a blanket. You're warm here, you're safe. Spring never arrived with fanfare. It came in quiet signs, a drip of snowmelt from the eaves, a patch of green at the edge of the woods, the first birdsong breaking the cold hush of dawn. For peasants, those signs were everything. They meant the world was waking up again. The long nights of hunger and cold were giving way to the promise of something new. But spring was as much a test as a gift. You'd rise early still, your breath white in the pale light, and walk the fields to see what the winter had left behind. The earth was soft but heavy, thick with last year's roots and the cold weight of months of frost. You'd take a spade to it, turning it over one slow row at a time. The work was hard and wet, your hands raw from the chill, but every furrow cut into the earth was a chance that the year ahead might be kinder. The kitchen garden, small and precious, would come first. There was nothing fancy, leeks, onions, maybe some broad beans if you had them. Every seed planted was a prayer for the months ahead. You'd watch them like a hawk, fussing over each green shoot that dared to rise into the cold spring air. The cows calved, the chickens began to lay more steadily, and that first cup of milk in the morning tasted sweeter than any feast. It was thin still, but it was fresh, and it felt like a promise. The children would run barefoot through the thawing mud, laughter echoing down paths that had been silent for months. Even the birds seemed to sing louder, their quick songs filling the air with hope. But you never let yourself forget that spring was a fragile thing. A late frost could steal the first green shoots. A hard rain could wash the seeds away. The landlord's steward would come, counting how many rows you'd managed to sow. His ledger didn't care about the cold or the hunger that still echoed in your bones. He'd take his share, and you'd bow your head and hand it over, because there was no other choice. Still, in the quiet of the evenings, you'd sit by the fire and feel something light stirring in your chest, a kind of quiet relief. You'd survived another winter. The stores might be gone, but the earth was waking up, and that meant you could start again. So tonight, as you rest in that slow, patient warmth, think of those first days of spring, the damp smell of turned earth, the soft green of new shoots against the gray of old snow, the slow, stubborn hope that carried peasants forward, one seed, one breath, one small promise at a time. We're not done yet. Summer was a season that didn't let you sit still. The sun rose early and stayed high, turning the fields to gold and the skin of every worker brown and burned. You'd wake before the first light cracked the sky, rolling out of the thin blanket you shared with your family. The air smelled different in summer, warm and heavy, sweet with the promise of hay and ripening grain. The work waited for you the moment you stepped outside. There was no end to it. Weeds grew faster than you could pull them, tall and thick and greedy. You'd bend over row after row, your back aching, your hands green with crushed stems. The grain, too, needed watching. A single storm, a single week of too much sun or too little could ruin everything. You learned to watch the sky like a living thing. You read the wind in the trees, the smell of rain on hot earth. Every small change mattered, because every stalk in the field was another meal for your family, or another empty night if you lost it. The kitchen garden grew in bursts of green and bright color. Leeks and onions, beans climbing rough sticks, patches of herbs that made the night's broth taste like something worth working for. Berries ripened in hedgerows, blackberries, wild strawberries, sweet and dark on your tongue. They were the closest thing to luxury you'd taste in a season that gave you no rest. Meals were still simple, but in summer they felt easier to come by. Fresh bread, baked in the communal oven, hot and crackling. A pot of soup filled with green things, simmering low over the hearth. A cup of ale to cut the heat, the sharp taste of yeast and barley, a comfort at the end of a long day. Evenings were brief and precious. You'd sit by the fire with your neighbors, sharing a story or a quiet laugh. Children dozed with heads in laps, their cheeks pink from sun and dirt. The work never really stopped, but in those warm, dusty nights, it didn't feel so heavy. You were alive and you were working. You had enough for now. The landlord's steward still came, counting out what was his, the best of the grain, the eggs and the milk that meant life to you. You'd bow your head and give it, because you had no choice, because it was better than losing the thin scrap of earth that fed your family. But there was pride too. Pride in the way your hands grew strong. Pride in the way the fields bent under the weight of the grain you had tended. The grain that grew because you'd willed it to. Pride in the way you could take the day's heat and make it your own. So tonight, as you lie back and let your mind wander, think of that summer air, the way it smelled of cut hay and warm earth, the taste of fresh bread after a long day's work, the quiet joy of knowing that for now, the world was green and full. We're not done yet. Ahead lies the rush of harvest, the final race to gather everything you can before the cold closes in again. But tonight, rest in this bright, busy season. You earned it. Harvest came on like a storm. The days turned hotter, the grain heavy in the fields, and every peasant in the village moved with the same quiet urgency. You could feel it in the air, the tension, the hope, the knowledge that this was the moment you'd worked for all year. There was no sleeping in, no waiting for the sun to rise. You'd grab your scythe at dawn, your hands already sore from yesterday's work, and step into the sea of barley and rye. The grain stood taller than your waist, thick and golden. You'd cut it row by row, the blade singing through the stalks, sweat running down your back. Children followed behind, tying the sheaves in bundles, their small fingers nimble and quick. Every bundle was precious, every armful a promise that you might make it through another winter. The air was full of dust and the sweet, sharp smell of ripening grain. Your arms ached, your legs burned, but there was no time to rest. The sky could turn without warning, a sudden storm, a hard wind, and ruin everything in a single afternoon. So you kept working. The midday meal was bread and a bit of cheese, eaten sitting in the dirt, your scythe never far from reach. A mouthful of water from a shared jug. A scrap of laughter, maybe, if the work was going well. But always the work called you back. Evenings were no gentler. You'd carry the bundles to the barn, stack them high, threshing late into the night. The rhythmic thud of flails echoed in the dark, dust rising in the lamplight like ghosts. Your arms grew numb, your hands raw, but you kept going. Because this was it. This was survival. The landlord's men would come, of course. They'd count every sheaf, take the best of the harvest. Their due, they'd say, as if they'd felt the ache in your back, the cut of the blade in your hand. You'd give it over, teeth gritted, because what choice did you have? Because it was better than seeing your family turned out, your small patch of earth given to someone else. Still, in those frantic weeks, there was pride too. Pride in the way the barn filled with the weight of your labor. Pride in the way the bread tasted sweeter when you knew you'd earned every crumb. Pride in the way the whole village moved together, every neighbor helping, every hand turned to the same desperate work. At night, you'd sit by the fire, your muscles trembling from the day. The children would sleep with dirt still on their feet, too tired to even dream. And you'd stare into the embers and think, we did it, for now. So tonight, as you close your eyes, let the rhythm of that harvest echo in your thoughts. The swish of the scythe, the soft clatter of grain into baskets, the warm, heavy smell of cut fields and sweat. Because for the medieval peasant, harvest wasn't just work, it was life, all in. The rush of harvest never lasted long enough. The barns were full, the cellars stocked, but every peasant knew it was never as much as they'd hoped. The landlord took his share, the church took its tithe, and what was left had to stretch across the long, cold months to come. So you measured everything, each loaf of bread, each bowl of dried beans. Every crumb counted. You saved the best grain for planting, even if it meant going a little hungrier, because next year's harvest depended on it. And still, some years, no matter how hard you worked, it wasn't enough. A summer too wet or too dry, a sickness in the animals, a storm that flattened the fields in a single night. When that happened, there was no mercy. The landlord's steward didn't care if the grain was thin or the bread was gone. He came with his tally anyway, his ink-stained fingers counting out what he said was owed. If you couldn't pay, he'd take your tools, your animals, anything that could be sold or claimed. The threat of hunger was a shadow that never really left. But peasants weren't fools. They found ways to stretch what they had. bread mixed with ground beans, a stew of wild herbs and scraps, a thin broth that warmed your belly even if it didn't fill it. When even that wasn't enough, they looked to the forest, the wild greens, the roots that push through the frost, the rabbits that could be snared if you were careful, if no one was watching. Because the forest was both fear and hope. It belonged to the Lord, they said, but it was there for everyone who needed it most. In the hardest years, you'd see it in the glances shared between neighbors, the quiet understanding. A loaf of bread slipped across a threshold, a pot of soup left at a door. No one said charity, because it wasn't about charity. It was about survival. It was about knowing that next year, it might be you who needed the help. But hunger didn't just steal strength. It stirred anger too. There were times when the weight of dues and tithes pressed too hard, when a village rose together, tired of paying what they didn't have. They'd march to the manor, not with swords or axes, just with empty bowls, with the quiet rage of those who had nothing left to lose. It didn't always change things, but sometimes just standing there together was enough to remind the lords that peasants weren't so easy to crush. Still, winter always came. The cold always pressed in, and the stores always ran low. And in those long nights, peasants learned to find strength in each other, in the small kindnesses, the shared warmth, the stubborn will to see another dawn. So tonight, as you lie in the hush of your own room, think of that, of the quiet acts of defiance, of the small ways peasants pushed back against a world that never gave them enough. Because survival wasn't just about food. It was about refusing to be forgotten. The forest was a world apart. It stood just beyond the edge of the village, dark and deep, older than any manor or church. For peasants, it was both danger and promise, a place to gather what the fields couldn't give, and a place to hide from what they couldn't fight. In those lean times when the granary was empty and the children's bellies hollow, the forest offered a kind of salvation. You learned which roots were safe to dig, which herbs eased fever or hunger. Nettles gathered in spring's first breath, wild garlic, its bright green leaves sharp on the tongue. Mushrooms, if you knew the difference between what would feed you and what would kill you. It was work, yes, but it was freedom too. No steward to measure what you took, no tally to pay. A rabbit snared in the undergrowth, a bird brought down with a well-aimed stone. You dress it quick, the blood still warm in your hands, and carry it home under your cloak. It wasn't a feast, but it was a meal. And in those quiet moments, there was a kind of fierce pride in taking what the land would give. But the forest was more than just a larder. It was a place to breathe, to walk under the high green canopy and feel, for a moment, that the weight of the landlord's due didn't matter. To feel small, but free. And so it became a place of stories. Old tales of spirits and saints, of green men who watched from the shadows, of witches who lived in the deep dark places where no one else dared go. In the evenings, when the work was done and the hearth was low, those stories came out. Children wide-eyed, the old ones' voices low and steady. The forest was fear, but it was also hope. It was there for those who needed it most. When the lords cracked down, when the taxes grew too heavy, some peasants took more than herbs and rabbits. They took wood for their fires, even though it was forbidden. They gathered fallen branches in secret, carried them home in the dusk, each step a quiet rebellion. Because warmth in winter wasn't a luxury, it was life. And if the law said the forest belonged to the Lord, well, the cold didn't care about the law. So tonight, as you let your mind drift, think of those shadowed paths, the smell of damp earth and pine, the hush of the woods, where every footstep was a whisper, the knowledge that even in the hardest times, there was always something left to claim, if you were brave enough to reach for it. Back at the hearth, the rhythm of the day settled into something slow and steady. For peasants, the hearth wasn't just a place to cook. It was the center of everything. It was where the day began and where it ended, where warmth and comfort and the smell of home all came together. The pot never stopped simmering. A pottage, thick or thin depending on what was left. Barley or oats, a handful of leeks, maybe a few carrots if you had them, a scrap of pork fat if you were lucky. It wasn't fancy, but it was honest. Each mouthful warm and filling in a way that carried you through another hour of work. Bread was always there, even when nothing else was. Rough and dark, made from whatever grain the land could give. Barley, rye, sometimes even peas, or beans ground in with the flour. You'd tear it with your hands, soak it in broth, chew it slow. It was more than food. It was a promise. You'd keep going. Some days there was milk, warm and rich from the cow, poured into wooden cups and shared with quiet gratitude. Eggs from the chickens, a rare sweetness when you could spare them. Cheese hard and sharp, cut in careful slices to last as long as it could. Nothing was wasted. Bones from the last slaughter were boiled until every bit of marrow had given itself up. Herbs dried and saved from the kitchen garden, thyme, sage, parsley, turned even the plainest dish into something that tasted of life. On feast days, when the church bells called for celebration, you might have more. A bit of honey stirred into the pottage. A chicken roasted on a spit, the skin crackling, the smell of it a kind of joy that made the whole room feel bright. Those meals were rare, but they mattered. They reminded you that life wasn't just toil, that there were moments of sweetness even in the hardest years. But most days, it was the same. A simple pot of pottage, a hunk of bread, a cup of ale or cider to wash it down. And in those small, steady meals, there was comfort, a sense that you'd done what you could, that you'd keep doing it, one pot, one loaf, one long, quiet night at a time. So tonight, as you let your mind settle into that hush of the hearth, think of the slow bubble of the pot, the smell of barley and herbs, the soft crackle of the fire, the quiet pride in every meal, no matter how plain, because it meant you'd made it through another day. Feast days were the bright spots on a peasant's calendar, a chance to pause, to laugh, to remember that there was more to life than work and hunger. They came like small blessings scattered through the year. Saints' days, holy days, the great feasts of Easter and Christmas. Days when the church bells rang not for labor, but for joy. On those days, the fields were left to rest, and the work of the hearth became something more than survival. Bread was baked sweeter, with honey if you had it, or dried fruit saved from the last harvest. Pies might appear, filled with apples or pears gathered in autumn's glow. A chicken or a goose, roasted in the hearth's hot heart, its skin crackling, its scent filling every corner of the low, smoky room. The ale was stronger too, brewed for celebration. Passed from hand to hand, each sip a promise that, for this one day, at least, you were more than the sum of your work. The children ran wild in the lanes, their laughter bright against the cold. There were songs, too, simple rounds sung in rough voices, feet stamping in time, the rhythm of the earth, and the body coming together in something close to joy. Neighbors shared what they could, even when the year had been hard. A loaf of bread traded for a jug of cider, a handful of herbs tied with twine, a quiet gift. Because on feast days, everyone remembered that survival wasn't just about food. It was about being part of something bigger, a village, a faith, a shared hope that flickered even in the darkest months. The church played its part too. Mass in the cool hush of stone, candles flickering like small stars. A blessing for the bread, the fields, the hands that would turn the earth again come spring. And then back home to the hearth, the low table crowded with what you could spare. Not much, maybe, but enough. Enough to laugh. Enough to feel the warmth of bodies pressed close. Enough to remember that life could be more than work. These feast days didn't erase the hunger of the lean years. They didn't fill the cellars or pay the landlord's due. But they gave something just as precious, a breath, a pause, a reminder that even in the hardest lives, there was still room for celebration. So tonight, as you drift into the soft dark of your own room, let that warmth settle around you. The crackle of the fire, the rough music of voices raised in song, the taste of bread, sweetened just enough to make you close your eyes in quiet pleasure. Famine didn't knock politely. It came in quietly at first. A late frost that killed the first shoots, a summer of rain that drowned the barley, a sickness in the cattle that took the milk and the meat in one breath. And then it settled in, filling the corners of every house, turning every meal into a question. For peasants, there was no escape. The barns might be empty, the cellars echoing with the sound of too much nothing, but the landlord's share still had to be paid. The church took its tithe, the manor took its due, and what was left was never enough. So you learned to stretch. Bread baked with ground beans, peas, even acorn flour, bitter and rough, but enough to keep the stomach from turning on itself. The pot on the hearth was thinner, the broth stretched clear with water. Every root, every green shoot in the woods was fair game: sorrel, nettles, wild garlic, bitter and sharp on the tongue, but alive. You learned to swallow the bitterness and tell yourself it tasted like survival. Some families foraged deeper into the forest, risking the Lord's anger for a few handfuls of mushrooms, a rabbit snared in the underbrush, because hunger didn't care about laws. And in those lean years, there was no shame in doing what you had to do. But still, famine didn't just steal food. It stole strength. Children grew pale and quiet, their bellies hollow. Old people faded into the corners, their hands too thin to work the fields anymore. There were no songs around the hearth on those nights. Just the hush of the fire, the creak of the wind in the thatch, the slow sound of breathing in the dark. Yet even then, there was a kind of stubborn grace in how peasants carried on. A neighbor would bring a ladle of thin soup to the door. A woman might share a handful of wild greens she'd found, her eyes bright with the small pride of having something to give. Because in those years, kindness was as precious as bread. And sometimes it was the only thing that kept you going. You'd find hope in the smallest signs: a patch of green pushing through the thaw, the first fat bee buzzing in the garden, the promise of milk when the cow calved in the spring. It wasn't enough to banish hunger, but it was enough to remind you that famine, like winter, would pass. So tonight, let your thoughts settle on those quiet acts of defiance: the pot of bitter broth shared across a threshold, the hand that reached out even when it had nothing left. Because even in the hardest years, peasants found a way to keep going, to keep planting, to keep hoping, to keep the smallest flame of life alive against the dark. Spring always came slower than you wanted it to. The snow melted in fits and starts, patches of brown earth showing through like bruises. You'd watch every inch of it, every drip of meltwater from the eaves, every crow's call in the morning, willing the season to turn. For peasants, spring wasn't just a new season, it was a lifeline. The stored grain was almost gone, the salted meat just a memory. But the earth was waking up, and that meant there was still a chance. You'd take the spade and turn the soil, thick and heavy with winter's weight. The first green shoots felt like a blessing, leeks and onions pushing up through the thaw, bright against the gray. Every handful of new growth was a promise you held close. The kitchen garden was the first hope, a patch of green in a world that still felt hard and hungry. You'd plant what you could: peas, beans, small seeds, saved from last year's harvest. Each one a gamble, but one you had to take. The animals, lean from the long cold, began to give again. A hen's egg, still warm in your hand, the first milk from a cow who had stood patient through the snow. Those small tastes of life were enough to lift the weight from your chest, just a little. Children played in the thawing mud, laughter ringing out like birdsong. The sun felt warm on your shoulders, even if the wind still carried a chill. You worked harder than ever, not just because the land needed it, but because you needed it. Because with every row planted, you were telling the world and yourself that you weren't done yet. But there was still caution in every breath. A late frost could come. A hard rain could wash the seeds away. You knew it, felt it in your bones, but you kept going anyway. Because there was no other choice. Because hope, in the end, was as necessary as bread. And so the village woke up with the earth. Neighbors helped mend fences, shared seeds when one family's stores ran too thin. The landlord's steward would come soon to count what you had, to claim what he said was his. But for now, there was a kind of quiet relief in knowing the soil was turning again, in knowing that even the harshest winter couldn't hold the earth down forever. So tonight, as you let the soft green of spring settle in your mind, think of those first shoots, the rough hands planting them, the careful prayers whispered over every seed, the small, stubborn joy of feeling life push back against the cold. By early summer, the fields were alive. The barley stretched green and thick, the beans pushed up in neat rows, the cabbages broad and heavy in the garden. It was a time of growth, but also of endless work. For a peasant, there was no rest. The sun was high and the days long, and every hour had its task. You'd wake early, the air cool and soft, and walk out to the fields while the dew still clung to the grass. Weeding came first, hands and knees in the dirt, pulling up what didn't belong so the crops could breathe. Your fingers were always stained green, your back bent and burning, but you did it because there was no choice. Because every weed left to grow was a stolen mouthful of grain come autumn. Water was carried in buckets from the stream or, well, heavy and cold, the path worn smooth by countless feet. You'd pour it careful at the roots, a small gift to the growing things that would one day feed your children. The animals needed care too. Cows driven out to pasture, pigs fed with scraps from the kitchen. The chickens, busy and noisy, gave eggs that felt like small treasures in your hand. There was never a moment to spare. But even in the middle of all that work, there were moments of quiet beauty. The way the wind moved through the barley, soft and silver in the morning light, the smell of warm earth and growing things, the sound of bees in the garden, a low hum that felt like the world itself breathing. Meals were still simple, but in summer they tasted like life. Fresh bread, baked in the communal oven, warm enough to steam in the cool dawn air. A bowl of soup green with herbs, sweet with the first young carrots. Ale that tasted sharp and clean on your tongue after a long day's sweat. In the evenings, the village came alive. Children ran barefoot in the dust, laughter ringing down the lanes. Neighbors gathered by the well, sharing news and small jokes, a moment of lightness before the dark. And when the sun finally set, the stars overhead felt closer somehow, the night warm and soft and full of promise. The landlord's steward still came, his ledger always waiting, his eyes counting what you had. But for now, the fields were green and the air was sweet, and you let yourself believe just a little that the world would be kind this year. So tonight, as you lie still and let the day's labor fade from your mind, think of those summer fields, the smell of cut grass, the taste of warm bread, the hush of night settling over the earth. The air changed as harvest drew near. The sun dipped lower. The fields turned gold, and every peasant felt the weight of the days in their bones. This was the moment everything hinged on, the season that decided if you'd have enough to carry you through the winter, or if hunger would come knocking again. You'd rise before dawn, the sky still dark and cool, your hands already rough with the memory of the scythe. The grain was heavy and thick, the heads bending low under their own weight. You moved slow and careful, the blade singing through the stalks, each sweep a breath of hope. Children ran between the rows gathering what fell, tying sheaves with quick fingers, learning the rhythm of the fields even before they could hold a plow. There was no time to rest. The days were long and bright, the work unending. You'd eat in the fields, bread and a slice of cheese, maybe a mug of ale to cut the dust in your throat. A moment's shade under a tree, a soft laugh shared, and then back to it. Because every sheaf gathered was another night of sleep come winter. The landlord's steward would come soon, his eye sharp for the best of the harvest. You'd see the carts roll by, heavy with the grain you'd cut with your own hands. And you'd swallow your anger because there was no choice, because to refuse was to lose even the thin scrap of earth that was yours. Threshing came next, the slow, steady rhythm of flails on the barn floor. Dust rose in the air, thick and choking, the smell of sweat and straw sharp in your nose. Your arms burned, your back ached, but the grain fell clean, the promise of bread in every kernel. And when the last sheaf was brought in, there was a kind of quiet pride in the barns full, and the cellars beginning to fill. You'd sit by the fire that night, your hands raw and your body sore, but your heart a little easier. Because you'd done what you could. You'd given the year your strength and your patience, and for now, that was enough. So tonight, as you let yourself drift in the soft hush of the evening, think of that golden light, the rustle of grain in the wind, the taste of fresh bread, warm and real in your hands. Winter didn't come with a rush. It crept in slow. The mornings colder, the nights longer, the first frost silvering the thatch. The fields lay empty and still, and for peasants, the work turned inward. You'd mend what was worn, a cloak patched with careful stitches, a wooden bowl smoothed and sanded until it shone. You'd count what you had, measure the cellars with a practiced eye, the turnips in the dark, the grain stacked in careful rows, the hard cheese hanging from the rafters. Every bit was a promise you held close. Meals were simple, a pot of pottage thickened with barley and leeks, left to simmer slow on the hearth. A crust of bread dark and hard, dipped in the broth to soften it. On lucky nights, a bit of pork fat, a slice of smoked fish, a taste of what the summer had given and what you'd worked so hard to keep. The hearth was the center of everything. You'd sit close. The warmth pressed tight against your skin, the smell of peat smoke sharp in your hair. Children played at your feet, their laughter soft, their voices hushed in the flicker of the fire. Stories rose in the quiet, old tales of saints and spirits, of green men and miracle loaves, the kind of stories that made the dark feel a little smaller. The landlord still came, even in the cold. He'd take his due, and you'd give it, because you had no choice. Because survival wasn't just about food. It was about keeping your place, your patch of earth, your small claim on the world. But in the quiet of winter nights, there was something like peace, a moment to rest, to gather your strength, to breathe. You'd watch the snow drift past the window, soft and silent. You'd feel the weight of the year settle in your bones, but you'd also feel the promise of spring, waiting somewhere beyond the frost. Because that was what peasants knew better than anyone, that the cold always ended, that green shoots would push through the frozen ground, that the earth, patient and stubborn, would wake again. So tonight, as you lie warm and quiet, think of that small, steady hope, the hush of snow outside, the slow bubble of a pot of broth, the soft breath of someone you love sleeping close. This was the true rhythm of the medieval world, not the bright feasts or the banners of war, but the quiet pulse of life in the cold, the small, hard-earned comforts, the promise of another dawn. And that, more than anything else, was how peasants survived,